Good evening, Community Covenant Church. There's an old legend that says, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, his mother Mary would often walk the way her son had walked on his journey to the cross, pausing here and there to recall something that had happened at that particular spot on Jesus' journey. From these walks grew the early Christian practice of walking the Via Dolorosa, the way of the cross, in Jerusalem, a tradition that continues to this day. When they returned home, those early pilgrims to Jerusalem talked about their experiences, and soon many people began erecting stations of the cross on the walls and grounds of their own churches so worshipers could make the journey whenever they wished. The number of stations ranged from as few as 7 to as many as 30. Over time, however, the number became fixed at 14. Including 5 stations depicting events that are not found in Scripture: the 3 falls of Jesus, the meeting with Mary, and the legend of Veronica's veil. On Good Friday of 1991, Pope John Paul II introduced the 14 scriptural stations of the cross that many Christians now use. Catholic and Orthodox Christians were the first ones to use the stations in their devotional life. In recent years, however, Christians of many traditions have been in the rediscovering process of this ancient devotional practice. The story of Jesus' final hours, traditionally called the Passion, is the central story in each of the 4 Gospels. It's a story we're all familiar with, and yet each Gospel writer tells it from a different perspective. This Good Friday service is unique in a number of ways. Number 1, we're not here. You're going to do it from home. Number 2, we're going to take a journey through the stations, and after each reflection, I'm going to encourage you to hit pause and discuss the questions. If you're by yourself, think about them. Answer them. Maybe share them with somebody at some point. I also encourage you, if you haven't done so already, right next to the link for this video, there are pictures that I encourage you to download and print because I'm going to be referring to them. If your kids are watching along, maybe they can color during this or use this as a devotional time to color afterwards. But I encourage you to pause after each reflection and really think about and discuss the questions. And finally, this is unique because you'll notice that the flames of the candles are reflecting off my tripod and my phone, and it looks like I've got tongues of fire dancing all around me. And we'll just count this as further evidence that Christ is present. Let's begin. Many Americans can remember exactly where they were on the morning of September 11th, 2001. Huddled around television sets and radios, they watched and listened to the news of the terrorist planes flying into the World Trade Center's Twin Towers. And then as the impact of just how many lives had been lost began to register, a great sorrow gripped the nation and the world. During a national day of prayer, just 3 days later, Billy Graham addressed the sorrow of the nation with these profound words. He said, quote, "The lesson of this event is not only about the mystery of iniquity and evil, but it's also a lesson about our need for one another. A tragedy like this could have torn our country apart, but instead it has united us." At this first station in the Garden of Gethsemane, we encountered Jesus in his moment of deepest sorrow and pain. But notice, as much as he is in agony, he's not alone. The scripture says Jesus went with the disciples in Matthew 26. And he then took his most trusted friends, Peter, James, and John, with him as he began the painful journey that would ultimately lead to new life. Although we tend to give them a bad rap for falling asleep 3 times, it's worth noting that at least they were present with Jesus in these moments in the garden. While most of us will not make history-altering decisions in our lifetimes, we all have moments of deep sorrow when we need to be surrounded by the love of our friends, especially those in the community of faith. Take a look at the picture that hopefully you've downloaded or perhaps even are coloring. How many tears do you see? As you begin this journey to the cross with Jesus, remember you are not alone. Remember also, quote, "At night we may cry, but when morning comes, we will celebrate," as it tells us in Psalm chapter 30, verse 5. Take a moment now and pause and reflect on the questions. Et tu, Brute? Even if you're not a Shakespeare fan, chances are you're familiar with this line from Julius Caesar. About a century before the betrayal of Jesus in Jerusalem, another betrayal occurred in the city of Rome. On the Ides of March, Julius Caesar made his way to the floor of the Senate where, to his great surprise, he found himself surrounded by assassins. An even greater surprise came when he realized one of them was his good friend and protege, Marcus Brutus. In crafting this dramatic scene, Shakespeare puts it into Julius Caesar's mouth these legendary words, Et tu, Brute? You too, Brutus? Someone once said that the saddest thing about betrayal is that it never comes from your enemies. And so it was with Jesus and Judas. The scriptures are quick to point out that Judas was one of the 12. It could even be argued that he was one of the more influential members of the inner circle. After all, he was the treasurer who made sure there was enough money to carry on the mission of building the kingdom. And yet, it was this one of the 12 who betrayed Jesus, setting in motion events that would ultimately lead to Jesus' crucifixion. We will never know why Judas betrayed Jesus. Some people believe it was because he had no choice. It was all part of God's preordained plan. Others think it was because, like Brutus, Judas was hungry for power and control of the group. Whatever his motives, his betrayal ultimately cost Jesus his life. Take a look at the picture that you're holding. Close to the betrayer's lips is an object that looks oddly like a crescent moon. In John's account of the Last Supper, after Judas gets up from the table to betray Jesus to the chief priests, John writes, "And it was night." Betrayal, especially by those who are closest to us, always feels as if a great darkness has descended. But take another look at the picture. Is this crescent a waxing one or a waning one? Is this picture getting darker or lighter? We alone have the power to choose what we do with a friend's betrayal. Take a moment and pause the video and discuss the questions. Station 3, condemnation. Devontae Stanford was only 14 years old when his life changed forever. While standing in his pajamas in his front yard, police arrested him for a quadruple homicide. He was taken to the police station, interrogated for 24 hours, and denied the right to see his parents or have an attorney present. Under the strain of those circumstances, he confessed to the murders, was tried as an adult, and sentenced to 39 to 92 years in prison. The problem? Devontae did not commit the murders. Another man came forward and confessed, but the state would not relent. But thanks to the advocacy of the Center on Wrongful Convictions at Northwestern University, Devontae Stanford was exonerated in 2016 after serving 9 years. According to the National Registry of Exonerations, since 1989 in the United States, there have been 1,966 innocent people exonerated for crimes they never committed. For many of them, their only crime is their poverty or their race. They are simply unable to afford exceptional legal representation, and because of the color of their skin, many juries sadly find it difficult to believe they did not commit the crime, so they are quick to condemn. As we arrive at this third station with Jesus, it is worth remembering that it was not evil people who condemned him. The people who passed false judgment were the good ones, the religious leaders, the ones who knew the law. Yet, in one of the saddest mockeries of justice in history, they sentenced Jesus to death, but not before they asked him this question: "Are you the Son of God?" Then, even after Jesus answered in the affirmative, they condemned the Son of God to death. How many people could be saved from the wrongful condemnation in our own courts of law if we simply acknowledge this truth? Like Jesus, we are all sons and daughters of God. At some point in our lives, most of us have heard this proverb: when you point a finger at someone, there are 3 more pointing back at you. Take a look at the picture. Notice all the fingers. Who are they pointing at? Are they your fingers? Take a moment to pause this and reflect on the questions or discuss it with someone else. Station 4, denial. In the autumn of 1934, the Detroit Tigers were in the middle of their first pennant race in 25 years. Hank Greenberg was one of the team's first basemen and one of the greatest sluggers of all time with a batting average of .339. If you don't know baseball, that's really good. The Tigers needed him in their game against the New York Yankees, but Greenberg, a Jewish American, was torn about whether he should play the game that day. It was September 1st, Yom Kippur. After consulting with his rabbi and family, Greenberg made the decision to not play. With American anti-Semitism on the rise, Greenberg's decision was not popular. Fans shouted, "Rosh Hashanah comes every year, but the Tigers haven't won the pennant since 1909. But Greenberg remained true to his convictions, attending synagogue services that day rather than denying his faith by playing a game of baseball on the Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the Jewish year. It's not always easy to be true to our religious convictions when forces from all sides are asking us to deny the very things that give us life. Peter found this out in the courtyard as he watched Jesus being led away to trial. Just weeks before, Peter had mustered up the courage to profess that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of the living God, as it tells us in Matthew 13. But now, when questioned, Peter denied he even knew his friend and Savior. Who knows what would have happened if Peter had the courage of his convictions at that moment? Would the questioning servant girl have come to believe in Jesus? Would Peter's testimony have been able to save Jesus from death? The Tigers lost to the Yankees that day. Who knows whether or not Hank Greenberg's decision to not play had anything to do with the results of the game. But what we do know is this: in a small way, his decision to not deny his faith helped pave the way for a more tolerant baseball league and society. Take a look at the next picture. Is the person with folded arms a defiant Peter? Or could it be a defiant Jesus saying to us, no matter how many times you deny me, I will always love you? Pause the video and take a moment to reflect on the questions or discuss them with someone else. Station 5, judgment. Chances are you probably have never heard of Agnes Gonjo Bojaju. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly. That's because we know her by another name, Mother Teresa. By the age of 18, she answered God's call to move to India and joined a religious order of nuns who had a commitment to helping the poorest of poor in that country. Later, this saint of the gutter, as she was sometimes called, founded her own religious order, the Missionaries of Charity, and dedicated the rest of her life to serving those whom society had judged as unworthy of love. Where others saw only the dregs of humanity, Mother Teresa saw the children of God. And where others judged people based on their position in society, Mother Teresa judged them based on their position in the reign of God. In fact, Mother Teresa is quoted as saying, quote, "If you judge people, you have no time to love them." At this fifth station, we find ourselves standing with Jesus in Pilate's judgment hall. He is tired and dirty from a sleepless night, humiliated by the spitting and hurting from the slaps of those who wish to mock him. His clothes are ragged and torn, and he is hungry. And in Mark 15, it tells us, then the chief priests accused him of many things. Most of us have probably encountered someone on a street corner or a bus stop or maybe a train station holding their hand out, asking for assistance of some sort. Many of the people we encounter in these situations look tired and dirty and hungry. And sometimes we begin to judge. And in our judgment of them, we found we had no time to love them. After the chief priests judged Jesus, Pilate handed him over to be crucified. Sadly, this is what happens when we judge others rather than loving them. Our judgment condemns them to the death of hopelessness. Take a look at the next picture. Notice all the fingers pointing in judgment. What if instead they were all extended with a handshake of solidarity for the person judged wrongly? Fingers pointed in judgment will never find time to love. Pause the video and reflect on the questions. Station 6, crowning. There is a contemporary icon, Madonna of the Holocaust. I encourage you at some point to look it up, which shows Mary dressed in the clothes of an early 20th century Eastern European Jewish woman holding Jesus on her lap. They are surrounded by barbed wire and the names of horrific places like Auschwitz, Birkenau, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. There is a large yellow Star of David sewn onto Mary's clothes and a dove in Jesus' hands. The imagery used in this icon is a stark reminder that Jesus and Mary were both Jews, and they had been living in Hitler's world, and had they been living in Hitler's world, would have been forced into a concentration camp because of their faith. At this sixth station, we see the agents of the state forcing Jesus to wear a crown of thorns and a purple robe to identify him as the King of the Jews. The phrase "the Jews" is sprinkled liberally throughout John's account of the Passion. Unfortunately, sometimes Christians have used this as an excuse for anti-Semitism and mistreatment of our Jewish brothers and sisters. But many biblical scholars believe that a more accurate translation of the Greek word "ladoai" would be Judeans, referring to a region, rather than Jews, referring to an entire religion. When it comes to religion and how we treat one another, words do matter. Whether Jesus lived in first century Jerusalem or 20th century Germany, he will always be found with the marginalized, the oppressed, and the forgotten. Take a look at the next picture. Notice the triangle in the middle. It seems to have broken pieces of glass or rocks strewn on it. As you color in the shapes at some point, be mindful of all the lives that have been broken over the centuries because of religious prejudice and the careless misuse of language. Take a moment, pause the video, and reflect on the questions. Station 7, bearing. The permanent collection of the Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma, Washington houses a sculpture by Howard Dale titled "The Burden." Crafted in bronze, the cross already has a weightiness about it as Jesus drags it behind him. But it is what is on the cross that makes it seem even heavier. Sculpted into the cross is 2 centuries worth of humanity, beginning with Adam and Eve at the bottom and ending with modern-day firefighters at the top. In a very powerful way, it visually demonstrates the cosmic consequences of Jesus' decision to take up his cross and carry it all the way to Calvary. This 7th station seems to be a very lonely one. John puts it this way, "And carrying the cross by himself, Jesus went out." John 19:17. Christians have argued for centuries over whether or not Jesus had to die. We have debated about the meaning of his death, and we have disagreed about its consequences. But what we do agree on is that somehow his solitary decision to take up the cross changed the course of history and had eternal consequences for all of humanity. The Orthodox tradition has long held that Adam and Eve had been waiting for centuries in their graves for the coming of the one who had rescued them from their sin and death. Perhaps as Jesus dragged his cross through the city streets that day, began to rip apart the hardened earth where Adam and Eve lay waiting for resurrection. And perhaps Jesus' decision to carry his cross right into the face of death that day is what inspires people like the firefighter in Dale's sculpture to walk into burning buildings to save others. Take a look at the picture for Station 7. Jesus appears to be carrying his cross resolutely with precision to the place of salvation. There is no hesitation. He is not looking back because he knows that his lonely decision will save humanity and inspire countless others to selfless acts of sacrifice. Again, pause the video and reflect on the questions. Station 8, helping. Parents are increasingly making volunteering a regular part of their routine if they have the time, whether it's delivering meals to the homebound, planting vegetables in a community garden, spending time with people at the local senior center, or whatever. And when parents and children engage in these activities together, the results are overwhelming. One study looked at 47,000 children in 5th through 12th grades in public schools across the United States. The study results indicated that children who served just 1 hour or more a week were less likely to be involved in at-risk behaviors than those who aren't active in volunteering. At this 8th station, we encounter Simon of Cyrene, the man whom the soldiers forced to help carry Jesus' heavy cross. Coming in from the country was Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, as Mark tells us in chapter 15. We don't know much about Alexander and Rufus. We don't know if they were children on the day of Jesus' journey to the cross, but imagine if they were. One tradition says that they went on to become missionaries in the early Christian church. Some have even suggested that the Rufus mentioned by Paul in his letter to Rome in Romans 16 is Rufus, the son of Simon Cyrene. Whatever the case, what we do know is that Rufus and his brother, Alexander, saw their father giving a helping hand that day to someone in need. And that someone in need just happens to be the Son of God. We should never underestimate the power of our own example in the lives of our children. Whether we have children of our own, nephews, nieces, godchildren, children of friends, they all look to us for examples of how to be kind and helpful to people most in need. Ralph Waldo Emerson once wrote that, quote, "The purpose of life is not to be happy. It is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have it make some difference that you have lived and lived well." Alexander and Rufus learned these traits from Simon. Take a look at the picture for Station 8 and notice all the lines that intersect. As you color them at some point, imagine all the lives that have intersected with yours over the years because of your kindness. Maybe you can write some of their names on the lines in the cross. Pause the video and reflect on the questions. Station 9, blessing. As Christians, we are keenly aware of the power of gesture in our communal life. The pouring of water, the breaking of bread, the washing of feet. All of these have deep meaning, but there is a gesture that may get overlooked from time to time. It is the gesture of raising one's hands in blessing. In more liturgical churches, the priest or minister blesses the congregation with the sign of the cross at the end of worship. Take a look at the next picture for Station 9. The way Jesus' hand is raised in blessing looks much like the way some ministers bless the congregation. It is the way Lutherans, Catholics, and Episcopalians bless themselves. 2 fingers up and 3 fingers down. Orthodox Christians place 3 fingers up and 2 down. Either way, there's profound symbolism in this gesture. The 3 fingers together represent the Trinity, while the other 2 symbolize the divine and human nature of Jesus. An ancient saying says, lex orandi, lex credendi. As the church worships, so the church believes. Look around the next time you're in worship. The gestures your congregation uses will give you a little insight into what your congregation believes. The fingers used in blessing remind us that God, in the presence of Jesus, became a human so that we, through the death of Christ, might share in the divine life of God. At this 9th station, Jesus encounters the women of Jerusalem, and we hear strange words. Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, Luke 23 tells us. But exactly the opposite of what we hear at the beginning of Luke's gospel, when Gabriel announces to Mary that she would give birth to Jesus. Luke writes, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." Perhaps the words in Luke's account of the Passion are a reminder to us that every moment of our lives, even those places that seem the most forsaken, maybe especially those places, can be places of God's blessing. And it is precisely in those most human conditions that Jesus wishes to bless, to transform, and to take up into the divine life. Take another look at the picture for this station. It looks as if Jesus' hand is covered in bandages. Some would suggest that we are most effective as agents of blessing to others when we have been wounded ourselves. Our own hurt makes us more empathetic to the pain of others. Hold your hand up, positioning like the hand in the picture. Who needs your blessing, your comfort today? Pause the video and reflect on the questions. Crucifixion. The image of the cross has become so commonplace that we tend to forget how truly revolutionary it is. In 1949, the communist regime in Poland began work on Nowa Huta, a new town just north of Krakow. In an effort to crush the Christian spirit of the Polish people and to reinforce the atheism of the Communist Party, the government decreed that there would be no church building in Nowa Huta. It was the first Polish city to be intentionally designed without a church. But the people's faith could not be so easily destroyed. They erected a large cross in the middle of the field where they wanted their church to be built. And each time they would put the cross up, the communists would bulldoze it down. In 1959, the young Archbishop of Krakow, Karol Wojtyła, celebrated Christmas Eve midnight mass under the cross in the field. Hundreds of people came, standing in the freezing Polish winter night to defy the government and worship the God who had come to set them free. And after each Christmas Eve celebration, the government would again tear the cross down, and the people would again rebuild it, and Archbishop Wojtyła would return each Christmas Eve to celebrate midnight mass. Finally, in 1967, the communists issued a permit for a church to be built. 1 year before he was elected Bishop of Rome, taking the name John Paul II, Archbishop Wojtyła dedicated the new church in Nowa Huta. A central element in the design of the church is a massive steel sculpture of the crucified Christ, made by the steelworkers of the city. Take a look at the picture for the station. On each crossbeam of the cross, it appears that ladders are descending and ascending. And what makes the crucifixion so revolutionary is the truth that God, in the person of Jesus, descended to humanity, took on all the sufferings of the world, and died for the salvation of all people, so that we might ascend to the heights for which we are created. The vertical beam, plunged into the dark earth, also reaches up to the highest heavens, spanning the gulf between God and humanity. And the horizontal beam reaches from the criminal on Jesus' right to the criminal on his left, spanning the distance between alienated brothers and sisters. Once Karol Wojtyła became John Paul, he took the message of the cross he had learned during that time in Nowa Huta to the entire world. For him, the way of the cross was the way to peace. The mercy extended by Christ at Calvary was the mercy we should extend to all people. And he knew that suffering and oppression will not last forever, because all has been redeemed through the life and death of Jesus Christ. Pause the video and reflect on the questions. Station 11, Promise. The Botanical Gardens just north of Chicago are stunning places of natural beauty. In late fall, the gardens are filled with massive plantings of chrysanthemums in every imaginable hue. In the winter, the beautiful twisted limbs and branches of barren trees are on full display against the dark sky. In the spring, tulips, daffodils, and crocus make their way up through the thawing ground. And at the end of the summer, the air is perfumed with the scent of roses making their last appearance before fall sets in again. In short, the gardens are a little slice of paradise. As he hung on the cross dying, Jesus promised the thief next to him, "Today you will be with me in paradise," as it tells us in Luke 23. This word that Jesus uses, paradise, it's a Persian word referring to a park or a garden. And it only appears 2 other times in all the Bible. Paul uses it in 2 Corinthians when speaking of a vision he had. And John uses it in the book of Revelation. to describe the life that awaits those who have been faithful. To everyone who conquers, I will give permission to eat from the tree of life that is in the paradise of God, Revelation 2:7. Jesus' words in Revelation are clearly an echo back to the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. The promise of Jesus is that in the end, all things will be restored to their perfect state, paradise. Take a look at the picture for this station. A garden of flowers appears to be emerging from the base of the cross. Paradise seems to be starting to bloom. During the worship of Holy Week, many churches have sung the hymn, "Sing my tongue the glorious battle." The last stanza says this in the hymn, "Faithful cross, true sign of triumph, be for all the noblest tree. None in foliage, none in blossom, none in fruit your equal be. Symbol of the world's redemption, for your burden makes us free." The message of this 11th station is that for those who place their trust in Jesus, paradise begins to blossom right here, right now. But just like the botanical gardens, there is a creative cycle in the paradise of life. Sometimes things are blooming all around us, and sometimes beauty is lying dormant for a while underneath the frozen earth. And sometimes things must wither and die in order to be renewed and reborn. This is all part of the life of paradise, but the promise of Jesus to the thief and to us is that today you can live with him there. Take a moment now and reflect on the questions. Station 12. Around 250, the year 250, a devastating plague swept from Ethiopia across North Africa, then to Italy and the Western Empire. At the height of the plague, which was most likely an outbreak of smallpox, 5,000 people a day were said to be dying in Rome. Many Roman citizens simply abandoned their family and neighbors, tossing them out into the street to die. But the early Christians went into the streets caring for the dying and burying the dead. Almost 200 years later, around the year 416, the Patriarch of Alexandria in Egypt organized groups of volunteers from the local church to transport and care for the sick. They were called parabolani, quote, the reckless ones, because they ventured into places of sickness and death where others refused to go. Where did these early Christians get the inspiration to be so reckless in their caring, not only for their fellow believers, but for all their fellow citizens? At this 12th station, we find the answer to that question. Jesus now, in his last moments of life, concerns himself not with his own suffering, but with the suffering of his mother and one of his best friends who were gathered at the foot of the cross. Mary, his mother, was most likely a widow at this point in her life. Now, with the death of her eldest son, she would be relegated to the lowest rungs of society with no one to look after her. So Jesus motions to John, the beloved disciple, and asked him to take Mary into his own care. "Behold your mother," Jesus says. And then he asked Mary to look after John as if he were her own son. "Behold your son." There at the cross, Jesus asked his followers to be reckless in their concern and care for others. He asked them to strip away the traditional ideas of what constituted a family and to forge a new family of faith that would care for one another at all costs. Tertullian, who was an early Christian leader in the 200s, once said that when the Romans saw Christians in action, they would exclaim, quote, "See how they love one another." As Christianity spread, so did the early Christians' love for each other and for others. They went on to establish some of the first hospitals in the world, buried the dead with dignity, and treated all people with care and respect. Take a look at the picture for the station. The beloved disciple's arm is lovingly placed around Mary's shoulders. As you color at some point, spend some time thinking about who is in need of your care in the moment. pause the video and reflect on the questions. Darkness. On July 1st, 1941, the Nazis occupied Riga, Latvia. 4 days later, every synagogue in Riga had been burned to the ground. Every synagogue except one. The Petev synagogue was too close to the city center, and the Nazis feared that setting it on fire would put the other city buildings in danger. So they ransacked it and converted it into a warehouse for their evil and dark purposes. If you go into a Jewish synagogue, you will notice that the most central feature of the sanctuary is the Ark, the Aron Kadesh, where the Torah scrolls are housed. Many arks contain heavy curtains that are pushed aside during worship to reveal the scriptures they contain. Following the war, it was discovered that the eastern wall of the Petev synagogue, the wall where the ark was located, was a false one. Christians from the local Reformed church, led by their pastor, Gustav Scharoms, had hastily erected the wall to protect the sacred scrolls. Today, the synagogue is a flourishing center of Jewish life within the city. The curtains on the ark in the synagogues recall the ones that originally hung in the Holy of Holies in Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem temple. Separating the people from the inner sanctum of the sanctuary, only the high priest was allowed to enter there, and only once per year. In the beginning of Luke's gospel, Zechariah, the high priest, is performing his duties behind that curtain when the angel Gabriel appears to him, telling him that he will have a son, John the Baptist. After John's birth, Zechariah sings the Benedictus, a song known to many Christians. The last lines of that hymn say, quote, "Through the heartfelt mercies of God, God's sunrise will break in upon us, shining on those in the darkness, those sitting in the shadow of death." That's quoting Luke chapter 1 from the Message. At this station, we arrive at the end of Luke's gospel. All hope that God's sunrise will appear seems to be lost. Darkness comes over the land and the sun's light fails. But then an amazing event happens in the midst of this darkness. The veil in the temple is torn in two. The false wall that had been erected between God and humanity comes crashing down at the death of Jesus. Just as the scrolls that were discovered behind the wall in the Petev synagogue gave light to that community, so the tearing of the temple veil at the death of Jesus reveals to us the light that God has always intended for creation. Take a look at the picture for this station. Notice that you are looking from behind the veil to the cross. It's as if we are always on the inside, just waiting for God's sunrise to break upon us. As you color in the images on the veil, be mindful of those who still sit in the shadow of death. How might you rip open the veil for them? Take a moment, pause the video, and reflect on the questions. And here we are at station 14. Burial. There is a story told in South Africa about some children who threw rocks at a delivery van one day. The army was called and they opened fire and they killed an innocent girl in the process. One of the soldiers was chosen to guard the little girl's body, which was just lying exposed while they waited for the authorities to come. Seeing that this girl was exposed, the soldier took off his own shirt to cover the child out of respect for her. Then he stood guard, dressed only in his pants, and when one of the other soldiers mocked him and asked, why would he do such a thing? The soldier replied, quote, "She is also made in the image of God." Christians throughout the ages have always given great respect to the human body after death. Whether through washing and anointing, incensing, sprinkling baptismal water, burying it in the earth, or returning a person's ashes to God's creation, Christians have ritually shown their profound belief that our bodies are dwelling places of God's Spirit. Our funeral practices are meant to remind us of the truth found in the opening chapters of the Bible when God said, "Let us make humankind in our own image." At this 14th station, we meet Joseph of Arimathea, a person of great wealth and merciful compassion. Mary was the widow of a poor carpenter, and Jesus was an itinerant rabbi. In the eyes of many, they were just poor peasants, but in the eyes of the state, Jesus was a criminal unworthy of a proper burial. But to Joseph, a secret follower of Jesus, Jesus was the very image of God, and as such, he deserved a proper burial. Jesus' followers and his friends still hadn't fully understood. Take a look at the picture that you're hopefully looking at or coloring or holding. On the front of the stone, there appears to be a seed hanging from the branch of a tree. Around the seed, it looks like things are beginning to emerge and grow. As followers of Jesus, the seed of resurrection, life has already been planted in our own hearts. But for a seed to flourish, for a seed to do what it needs, it must first go into the ground. It first needs darkness. And as seeds that produce life get put into the ground, Jesus' death on the cross and burial in the tomb, so must Jesus had gone to darkness before there is light.